Okay, this is a brief audio review for Chapter 5, Expressing Inequalities, Prejudice, and Discrimination in Everyday Life. Okay, so stereotypes, they refer to them as the building blocks of bigotry. So stereotype is just an oversimplified picture of the world, an overgeneralized belief that a certain trait, behavior, or attitude characterizes all members of some group in society. So it's normal, or the normality of stereotypes is the fact that our brains really like dichotomy. We like to think of things as this or that, good or bad, strong or weak, us or them, right? We stereotype people based on assumed group assumptions, right? So we look at an individual and put them in a group, and then we take our stereotypes about that group and apply it to the individual. So stereotypes are also very resistant to change, and they tend to persist over time because they kind of get built into our social interactions. So there's even a negativity of positive stereotypes, right? So even the most positive ones can be harmful. So we have that stereotype of the model minority, right? So while Asian Americans statistically have been more successful at assimilation, this assumption of the model minority downplays the real problems that Asian Americans continue to face in all areas of public and private life. So it's just kind of, again, a stereotype, an oversimplification of the experiences of an entire group of people based on that stereotype. And if anything, that positive stereotype, the model minority, really minimizes the struggles that a lot of Asian Americans face. All right, the lady and the natural good mother. So it's commonly believed that women are kinder, gentler, more nurturing, and more refined than men. So the downside of this is that women, this kind of women are nice stereotype, is that women are, when they're professional and they have to inhabit qualities that are considered more masculine in the world of work, they are perceived differently than men who have the same qualities. So when it comes to these stereotypes, the most lasting is the assumption that women are hormonally predisposed to be better parents than men, right? That maternal instinct, we still believe in that crap, and not that we've been socialized to provide different roles. So another intersection that they talked about in the chapter was this narrative of the strong Black woman. So this is a historical and cultural image that's, a stoic, tireless, deeply caring, invulnerable woman who perseveres through adversity, right? And we have some of these archetypes in history to point to, right? Like Harriet Tubman, right? And largely, this had a lot to do with the way that men were characterized at the time period, meaning in times when Black men were considered a threat to white men's labor, Black women weren't. So they had a lot more agency and ability to get jobs, to keep their families afloat, to be the strength of that family. And the stereotype we have now of this Black woman kind of evolved from the mammy stereotype, which was a poorer woman who was fierce, but not because of her intellect and her heart, but because she was socially constructed as animal-like or subhuman. And these constructions were really in opposition to white femininity that was seen as delicate and morally superior upper-class white women, right, who were the product of refined and civilized lifestyles. Plus, women of color were working to support their families, and as a result, the working itself went against the notion of what was a proper woman in society. So characterization of Black female strength is a double-edged sword that defends the current stratified social order by obscuring Black women's continued experiences of suffering, desperation, and anger. All right, when it comes to prejudice, prejudice is when stereotypes become the basis of belief in rigid, unfavorable judgments and feelings about members of another ethno-racial, gender, class, or sexual group. So specific historical events can also shape prejudices. So when you think of a terrorist, what image comes to mind? Is it the Oklahoma City bomber? Is it the white ranchers taking over a Federal Reserve? Typically, we think of people from the Middle East as terrorists, especially after 9/11. There was even the birther issue raised by Trump, alleging that not only is Obama from another country, therefore not a valid president, but he's Muslim and not a Christian, a secret Muslim, right? So it is akin to asking a person of color where they're from, and they're like, America, right? So again, the assumption of normality is white. But for presidents, it's not just white. It's male, it's heterosexual, it's married, typically with children, Christian, rich, privileged, and until Obama, white. When it comes to the politics of racial prejudice, the Obama effect or backlash. This is something I'm fascinated by because I like to study politics. So what seems to have happened is that now, that we're this far in, there's two different camps about at the opposite end of the spectrum. There's that birther folks, right? Those people that they basically tried to say that Obama wasn't a real president. He was like a Kenyan Muslim or this kind of thing. And again, what would be wrong with being Muslim? It just isn't the hegemony for presidents, right? But he's not. So there's also that. And then there's the colorblind racists, right? The people that allege that since a mixed race person became president, then you can't say that there's still barriers, right? So if people complain about inequalities in race, they're just pulling the race card or complaining for their own shortcomings. So not only is that ignorant, but it also ignores the structural barriers and historical legacies of inequality. And we often use token examples of people who overcame adversity to try to argue that the adversity never existed in the first place. It's just about people not working hard enough. So some prejudices can change over time, but one that stayed relatively unchanged is that of gender prejudice. Over the years, women have been constructed as passive, emotional, fickle, and dependent on men. And it's expressed in society both overtly and subtly through physical domination, condescending comments, sabotage, exploitation. So some of these come from a hostile place, but there's also others that are more benevolent. And sexual prejudice, or heterosexism, places homosexuals as low on the social ladder and historically constructed people as abnormal, deviant, and ultimately dangerous to the values of society. So from a sociological perspective, we can see that there are some people that, or some groups of people that are more homophobic than others, right? People that are homophobic tend to be older, tend to be less educated, tend to live in more rural areas, and often don't know anyone who's gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transsexual. And also when it comes to gender, women tend to be less homophobic than men. This demonstrates that one's heterosexuality and conformity to traditional gender roles seems to be more of a concern for men than women because men are higher in the social hierarchy, so they have more to lose from being pushed down the social hierarchy. So with privilege or prejudice, privilege, and ideologies of inferiority, so many different group identities we find, as many group identities as there are, we find prejudices. So not all prejudice is created equally. Also, when we focus on an individual person, like Trump's racism, we fail to see the larger historical and cultural underpinnings of prejudice. So sociologists want to understand how individual prejudice becomes a structural phenomenon. They argue that there's some factors involved, right, such as a belief in innate difference, meaning those people are not like me, and feelings of superiority, those people are not as good as me. So Herbert Bloomer added two more: entitlement, the belief that one's group has a rightful claim to certain privileges or advantages. When these feelings of entitlement combine with a suspicion of the subordinate group, that they want what the dominant group has, the result is prejudice. And so what's important about these feelings, the difference, superiority, entitlement, suspicion, is that they combine to reflect hierarchical positionings of groups in society. All right, so in the 18th and 19th century, most white people believed in the biological truth of a racial hierarchy, including George Washington, Jefferson, Darwin, Lincoln, right? They all believed in the natural inferiority of those who were not seen as white. It was accepted in science and in medicine. So all research has found that there's more variation within race than between races, whether you're looking at the physical or mental aptitude. Despite evidence, beliefs about racial inferiority serves to benefit the dominant group, so it tends to stay around. There's also a moral justification for unequal treatment, like the huge wave of lynchings that happened during the early Jim Crow segregation era was motivated by the myth of black male rapists, right? That they're trying to steal white women or hurt white women, right? So no matter the logic, it is a victim-blaming logic, blaming an individual for their lot in life without looking at the larger social context, right? There's always a justification for unequal treatment in the culture. When it comes to gender and biological inevitability, like race, the ideology that supports gender prejudice is biological. The information and roles about women were historically constructed in opposition to men's roles, almost as a way to distinguish what a man is not. So the idea that a woman is more biologically nurturing can be seen in women's expected roles in society and in the institution of the family, but also in what professions are dominated by women, such as teacher, nurse, daycare providers, maids, social workers, etc. These tend to be extensions of those gendered assumptions about the proper roles for women. Okay, so hidden privilege of social dominance. So racial transparency is just the experience of having no color, being the racial norm of society, not needing to think about race because you don't face racial discrimination. So when it comes to the invisibility of whiteness, this doesn't mean that white people are never discussed. They are just instead the default setting for society. So if you turn on TV, pick up a magazine, you will see white people. When whites talk about each other, they're simply people, right? They're not racialized. So this leads into its own stereotypes. Even when stereotypes form about white people, they reflect the privileged status in society. So many assume whiteness means the absence of culture. Others define them in opposition to others, like regular music versus Latin music. Whiteness was also signified by commodities, Wonder Bread, Kleenex, mayonnaise, right? Which linked them to the larger economic forces in society, very different than other races. The intersection of wealthy white men and perceptions of race. So understandings about the most privileged are still relatively unknown. For rich men studied in the book who were very segregated financially from the rest of society, they remember their first experiences with people of color being their family's servants, putting the assumption into their head of the social roles. And so their perceptions have everything to do with those interactions. So to complicate this further is still the issue of within-group prejudice, right? So most people think of prejudice and bigotry between groups in society. But due to the social message of hegemony, many people lower in the social ladder learn to internalize the messages of society. So this means that people that are lighter skinned within a racial group are still privileged, right? Or the notion of colorism within group prejudice. All right, so discrimination, inequality in action. So personal discrimination is just unfair treatment of a certain group by individuals. Some people experience quiet bias. That's the discrimination that's more subtle than others. Sometimes these are microaggressions, so that people feel others have hostility towards them, but they do not engage in acts of discrimination because of laws or customs against open discrimination. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later as well. So the enduring importance of race. Some argue that race is no longer an issue because overt racism of the past is gone, such as segregation. Even though class and race are still strongly related, people of color who are affluent still suffer discrimination, right? So more often, people of color are asked to speak on behalf of their entire race. Many argue that their job is stressful because of the discrimination that they face from their white coworkers who treat them disrespectfully. And that's more stressful than the actual stressors of the jobs they're working in. So race is clearly still an issue in American society, as we see, especially in our politics these days. So coming to the intersection of race, class, gender, and everyday social encounters, the book uses the example of the code of the street to explain how these intersectional ideas structure people's lived experiences. So in the book, he finds the residents of both poor and wealthy neighborhoods are incapable of distinguishing law-abiding young men from criminally involved young black men. Instead, people rely on stereotypes, right? That whites are middle class, law-abiding, and trustworthy, and that young black men are poor, crime-prone, and dangerous. In response to these stereotypes, more affluent black men have to find ways to disarm people or put them at ease so that they can counter the negative assumptions that they face from others based on their skin color. When it comes to global ethnic violence, violent ethno-racial discrimination is not just for Americans. It's the rule, not the exception around the world. So the book gives several examples of this. And racial and ethnic hatred costs the lives of millions of people around the world every year. And often this conflict is the result of past colonization, those kind of deep inflicted wounds of power and control that still have never been addressed. Institutional discrimination is just the established laws, customs, policies, and practices that systematically reflect, produce inequalities in society, whether or not individuals maintaining these practices have discriminatory intentions. So it can only work to the advantage of those who are privileged through these unequal systems, like white people, men, heterosexuals, able-bodied people, young people, thin people, et cetera, times a million, right? So it's not necessarily someone's individual intention, it's the structure of the system itself, like when we talked about the 100-to-1 rule, right, of cocaine versus crack cocaine sentencing as an example.